welcome everyone to our panel discussion, and welcome to VICA's 26th Annual Business Forecast Conference. My name is Kevin Tamaki. I'm with AT&T and also serve in a leadership capacity with VICA as the first vice chair. And also we're a very proud sponsor of this particular panel. Being a technology company, we're very interested in issues around privacy, technology, and the internet. And I'd also like to thank our track sponsors for their generous support, Caruso Affiliated and Southwest Airlines for sponsoring, so thank you to them. One bit of housekeeping, but it is very important housekeeping, is before you have this, what's this called, goldenrod slip of paper, which is your exit survey. We would love to have your feedback from this panel, so please fill it out and hand it out to a VICA ambassador, staff member, or leave it at the registration table in the foyer. And thank you for that. You know, we really, and this comes as no surprise, we rely so much on the internet these days in every aspect of our lives, work, leisure, whatever it might be. I mean, who doesn't have a cell phone? That's almost ridiculous question now. The smartphone adoption is around 68% now. About 40% of Americans have a tablet. Apps are so popular, most people use music apps, they use social media apps on their smartphones. It's becoming quite ubiquitous. It's everywhere. We use it in the office and at home, and so that's something obviously that is a big part of our lives and growing. The amount of use of data is huge. I'll give you one stat. It's not really commercial. It's a fact that since the advent of the iPhone in 2007, from 2007 to 2013, the amount of internet data on AT&T's network increased by 50,000%. 50,000%. And so you can imagine, with that type of growth and demand, how does AT&T or any provider keep up with that? It's a daunting task, and that's one of the things that I do. I'm actually a lobbyist for AT&T, and so I try to get those wonderful cell towers into people's neighborhoods, and they just love them. So anyway, before I introduce our panelists, I also wanted to show you something that I just found just last night. It's really cool. My stepson, he works for a technology company. He just started there. It's in downtown Los Angeles, which is great. They're creating 150 jobs in downtown LA in the tech sector. And his company's called Daiquiri, and this is not really an advertisement either, but he showed me this. It's a chip. It looks like your average poker chip. You can take this to Las Vegas with you, but what it does is that it has this a picture on here, and if you get the app, you take your smartphone and you scan it here. But it's not a QR reader, it's not a barcode, because those, if you know those, they'll take you to a website. What this does is that, and I wish I could show all of you maybe afterwards, but if you scan it, it will actually generate a three-dimensional picture on your smartphone with like a video, real motion. And it's connected to the internet, but that particular image is generated by this picture right here. So I was just thinking, you know, what if I'm at the mall and I have maybe my smartphone or maybe some glasses, like that company starts with a G, we don't name it because they're a big competitor of ours. And you're walking down the mall and you're looking at, and the retailer has a symbol. It doesn't have to be this, but it could be something else. And when you look at it, it generates this video, and maybe it could be the Gap or something like that, and it shows maybe kids or someone else with these clothes and say, oh, by the way, we're having a 50% off sale. You know, think about that type of application. So it's very cool and it's very exciting. So we're going to talk about, I think, issues similar to that on the privacy side. So hopefully you'll be able to think about those and generate some questions, because we're going to leave a lot of time for questions and answers. So please, ask your questions, and we'll have a great discussion here. Let me introduce our panelists. And by the way, their bios are in the program, so you can read about them more fully at your leisure when you get home tonight. So let me start with Emily. Emily Schlesinger is a regulatory affairs attorney for Microsoft Corporation. And next to her is Michael Lattimore with Southern California Edison. He is an information technology specialist. Next to Michael is Tanya Forsythe, who is an attorney partner at Baker Hostetler, LLP. And last but not least is Russell Buteau, who is National Director of Microsoft Practice for SATA Systems. So welcome to our panelists. It's great to have you here. So the format's like this. We'll start off with a brief comments from our 4 panelists, and then after that we'll jump into questions. So we'll start with Emily, please.
Hi, I'm Emily, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you a little bit about privacy. So before I came to Microsoft, I actually just started last April, and before I came to Microsoft, I was a litigator at Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, which Tanya might be familiar with. It's another large law firm based in Palo Alto, California. And prior to that, I worked in the public sector. I worked for some federal judges in the federal courts, and then also did some work for the Ohio Attorney General's office. And I think that background, that varied background, has given me some good insight into the fact that privacy is ubiquitous, as you were saying. Privacy is an issue on everybody's lips right now. And another concept that I think I've picked up from operating in all of these different forums is that I think we need to frame the issues that we're touching on today with the caveat that there really is no one definition of privacy. I think broadly as a concept, we can say that privacy means that people want to control who they share their information with, and it means that they want to control how that information might be used. But, the context is key here. So where I might not care if, for instance, if Facebook or some other app has access to my address book or, my geolocation, or I would like that ad from the Gap when I'm going into the store, my parents or my grandmother might have a very different feeling about what that means for them. So I kind of think of privacy more as a shortcut term. I think it's a useful conversation starter. And I think when we are engaging in this discussion here, we need to continue to remind ourselves that context is key to this discussion.
Yes.
Thanks, Emily. Michael, please.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Emily, for setting the stage. And I agree, the context is definitely the key. Just by way of introduction, I came into this business when we used to use these little plastic square things.
What is
you might
that?
remember these. They're called diskettes, right? And they had some even bigger than this. And in those days, privacy and data concerns were limited to who's got your diskette, who's got access to it, right? Today, as we've just heard, and from that wonderful demonstration from Kevin, technology and information is pervasive. It's in places that we don't even imagine that it is. So too are breaches, the possibility of breaches, of our privacy leaking out from places that we're not aware of. In 2014 alone, we've experienced about 500 million pieces of information breached, major breaches. You can go to a website called informationisbeautiful.net, and they show you this wonderful visual depiction of the largest data breaches. And so they show you the 142 million records lost by eBay this year, the 60 million from Target, the 56 million from Home Depot and counting. I looked at it this morning, I didn't see Albertsons on there, but you know Albertsons was breached. In addition, in our industry, there's word that there's about 10 other major retailer breaches just waiting to be released. They haven't gone public with that information yet. So, you know, these companies had technology, they had technical defenses, technical controls. They were hard and crunchy on the outside. They had state-of-the-art firewall, advanced intrusion detection systems. They were hard and crunchy on the outside. But they had one thing in common. They were soft and chewy on the inside. The human firewall failed. Invariably, when you trace these down to the root, what you find is that there was some human interaction. There was a human who clicked the link, installed the malware, downloaded that malware to the device. They inserted that infected USB drive. And so, you know, our challenge for all of us is how do we impact the human firewall? How do we raise the awareness of the users, the custodians of the data, the ones that actually have control over, you know, the privacy of that data? And so what I'm going to share about today is about the value add of investing in cyber at home. People need to be motivated to protect data, to be involved with the security program. Otherwise, it's just a list of standards and policies and, you know, like who cares? But when they're motivated and they have the knowledge and the ability to be cyber champions for themselves and for their families, they're likely to be safer in the workplace. And so hopefully, you know, we get a chance today to discuss some of those ways that we can increase the human firewall in our environments.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. I'm a little bit more uneasy than I was about 10 minutes ago, but hopefully there's room for optimism there. Thanks. Tanya,
There's hope.
please.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. Unlike data, which can be everywhere at any time, human beings cannot always get where they need to be on time at any time. It's apologize. I'm still trying to develop this sort of virtual clone so that this doesn't happen. But I'm very pleased to be here. My practice is focused on privacy and data security compliance, incident response, and litigation, all related to these issues. And I've been doing this for 10-ish years or so since it started to become a much bigger deal. Before that was a general commercial litigator. And these issues became so prominent that we had to develop specialized legal practices to deal with them. Interestingly, although these breaches have been going on, many people may remember the big Choice Point breach in around 2005 that also was really massive and resulted in, among other things, a fine from the Federal Trade Commission of $10 million. That was almost 10 years ago, and yet, interestingly, these issues are really now only now becoming front of mind for a lot of organizations. I think Target has a lot to do with it. I think Home Depot and the others, it's all just the sheer volume of these breaches and the consequences to the highest levels of the company, the C-suite. So finally now, what used to be kind of a obscure area, and I used to get questions like privacy law. What is that, a legal practice? That doesn't happen anymore. So what I want us to all think about, I guess, so I like that, you know, Michael is talking about the human side and what we can do at home. You know, I think I'd like to talk about what organizations can be doing internally to promote good data practices, and there is a big difference between just compliance and actual good security. There's also a difference really between security and privacy, frankly, a distinction that gets a little blurred sometimes, but security really relates to protection of all kinds of information. Privacy, we've already pointed out that there's no good definition, but privacy has more to do with, you know, collection, use, sharing, control of an individual's data. So privacy doesn't always involve security, but you can't really have privacy without security. And security goes way beyond privacy. It does not just involve personally identifiable information, those kind of situations. But we're going to talk about both, I think. And I would just mention, we've already talked about fun gadgets and things. You know, the Internet of Things and wearable technology, those kinds of things have really had a major impact and also raised awareness of these issues, because now the data really is everywhere all the time, constantly being tracked. And the cloud, of course, which is not really new, but has become huge. And so with the cloud, we have to be even more cognizant of these things.
Thank you, Tanya. Russell.
So I'm probably the person with the distinction of having the most responsibility for your security and privacy issues, having sold technology solutions over the last 20 years to help people put more information on the internet, right? And the thing that I thought about this morning that probably nobody here realizes is that the whole purpose, the sole purpose of the internet was to make sharing more open, by definition. And the first thing that happened was all these universities says, hey, let's just share everything. Let's not worry about the consequences because it's a noble purpose. And so here we are today, 50 years later, saying, oh my God, how do we keep ourselves from having exposure from people that are out there on the internet? Because what typically happens with anything that's developed is that people find a way to commercialize it. And so from a technology perspective, the ability to disrupt a business using that technology circumvents the need to protect and secure information that's contained therein. So it's a risk-reward play. So as an example, I was talking to my parents and I said, I called them this morning when I was driving up. I had a long drive. Dad, and my dad is a retired security analyst for a large county here in Southern California. He was in IT his whole life. Knowing what you know now, if you wanted to keep your stuff secure and private, what would you do? And he said, well, I get some seeds, I get some bullets, I get some gold bullion, and I'd go live out in the wilderness, because that's the only way. And even then, you're probably still not going to maintain privacy given our remote sensing abilities in the world. So to throw that out there, just to put it in context, I don't really believe there's ever a true notion of security or privacy. It's more how you respond to it and how you plan in multiple layers to defend against those breaches. And some of you probably saw the news today, JP Morgan announced a breach. The most interesting thing about that breach is, if you ever watch a good movie where they're breaching some financial company, what's the first thing they do? They connect, they push a button, they start downloading, you see a screen show them transferring money. No accounts were breached. Nothing was done except the data was collected, and they left with that. And that really says something, because it's not the money they wanted. It's the data of the customers that they wanted, and the net present value of what that can mean to them in the future. So it's a rapidly changing world, and I'm pushing that change on you. So that's kind of my context, is to tell you what you should do to get more benefit, but also how do you do it in a controlled way.
Thank you. Thanks for your opening statements, and I'll start off with a question, and this has to do with standards and practices and laws. And in my job, technology always is leaping ahead in terms of regulation. Governments are always playing catch-up in terms of how they should view technology and apply rules to it. And so we're always fighting a situation where we don't want to have a hodgepodge of regulations and rules and ordinances out there, something that's more uniform. So my first question is to Emily, is that there's no uniform standard for laws and regulations regarding employee privacy and security. Being a global company with employees that are everywhere, worldwide, how does Microsoft account for all of these different rules and its policy standards and procedures?
Right. Well, so that is an excellent question. Microsoft right now has nearly 130,000 employees globally. And as Kevin said, there's a patchwork of different laws and regulations. We're also, excuse me, I have this any. But we're also dealing with several different cultures, and as I said, context is key. So privacy can also be different culturally. So we really try to make sure that we don't have one single standard, and we recognize the diversity among our employees and try to set minimum requirements that can then be supplemented with additional procedures and guidelines beyond that. So a good example would be we have something called our Microsoft Employment Data Protection Standards, which was developed internally about how we can collect, use, and process employee data as a company. And we have minimum standards that are set that apply to everyone, but then when you go to the EU, where there's a heightened sense of privacy, there's going to be additional data protection notices that are in place that have to be adhered to in order to meet those jurisdictional requirements.
Thank you. Michael, what is, from your perspective, what's been the biggest misconception about privacy and technology that you've encountered with employees and customers? I know Southern California Edison is a large enterprise, and I'm sure there are a lot of layers and a lot of issues that are out there. So,
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. As speakers alluded to earlier, one of the main issues when you're dealing with information sharing and information usage is control, managing the risk of control. Sure, you know that the information is going to be shared, but you want to be able to control how that information is shared. For example, personal information that's being sold to websites like Spokeo and Spoke and Intellius, so anybody could go out and for $14.95 get a dossier of your private information without just paying that fee, and they don't have to show any other credentials. So in essence, we're all naked in cyberspace. So we know that. One of the misperceptions, though, of risk from the employer's standpoint is that technology will save us, that we can have sufficient layer of technical controls that we can keep that data from leaking out. And of course, as we've all shared, there's the human factor. And if the human beings have a faulty firewall and they're not aware, they don't have the desire to implement the controls and support the controls, maybe they don't have the knowledge or the ability. They don't know how to do it. And then they might be afflicted with that affliction called CRS, where they can't remember stuff, right? and they forget. They say, oh yeah, I remember I read that, but I forgot. So one of the misperceptions of the risk has to do with our reliance on technology. Oftentimes, we think the technology is going to be enough. And I would offer that we need to have a mix, just as Tanya talked about security and privacy actually being two separate entities, but very much connected, and they have some common touch points. And so we have an opportunity, I think, to treat privacy like we treat security, and to raise people's awareness of the issues, empower them with the knowledge and the ability to be able to make the right decisions as custodians of this, and then to actually reinforce that desire. And one of the ways that I alluded to in my opening statement is to focus on making people cyber champions from the home perspective, and say, what we'd like to do is to help you be safer yourself and protect your family. Protect your children, your grandchildren, your nieces and your nephews. So that way, there's a desire, and the people are motivated then to become active custodians and champions of the security controls that we have in place. So I think that's...
I'm curious then, at Southern California Edison, are there programs or are there specific initiatives that are presented to employees and customers that are, what's sort of the
Exactly.
tangible-
So right after around the time of the Choice Point breach and around the time of the AOL breach, you might remember the 92 million records that were stolen by a malicious insider at AOL. Around about that time, we began Home Computer Security Series. These were brown bags, informational. We taught people about identity theft. We actually used widely available information from the ftconline.gov, things like this. I've got some examples if you'd like to avail yourself of those. And we began to help people learn how to protect themselves against identity theft, how to use a layered defense strategy and putting antivirus and a firewall, a personal firewall on their home devices. And we began to develop a network of advocates and champions. This was in 2005. So today, we've got a pretty sophisticated cyber at home program. And as we were talking about, Kevin, we are now starting to move into the external space with our customers, our vendors, particularly our vendors, because we've read the story about what really happened with Target, and it was a vendor encroachment, right? It was a breach that happened from a vendor who just wasn't aware. So we're now stepping in that direction, and we feel that you can't have too much awareness. And I enjoy doing it. I'm passionate about it, and I like delving out a healthy dose of healthy paranoia. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Michael. Tanya, here's a sort of a legal question for you. Sort of the environment right now, from your perspective, are consumers and businesses, are they safer now? Are they more protected in terms of privacy and
Well, I think that the corporate side of things, the private sector has made a lot of progress, as you've heard from some of the folks here. Certainly, if we compare to where we were 10 years ago, there's been a significant amount of progress, and many large organizations in particular have taken notice of these things and have invested in the proactive efforts to try to prevent these things going forward. And so that was not so true 10 years ago, and I think in that respect, yes, corporations are probably better protected to some extent than they were before. But, the bad guys are always working, and probably more quickly than the good guys can, to find the next way to break through. And so in many cases, it's one of these whack-a-mole situations. And as has been pointed out by Michael and others, if you have, you're only as strong as your weakest link in some situations, and the social engineering side of things where, someone can creatively get into an organization using very basic techniques, really personal relationship type techniques to get through to even a low-level person within an organization who may not realize or may be fooled into thinking that they are talking to somebody who is entitled to receive credentials. And from there, I'm sure people remember the RSA security token hack, or not hack, but incident a few years ago. RSA tokens are those two-factor authentication tokens that many people, many organizations use to help with remote access and other issues. RSA itself had an incident that started, as I understand it, from publicly available information, started originally with social engineering issues to get into the system. So have we made progress? Yes. Is there a lot more work to do? Yes. When you read stories about what happened with Target and others, you kind of scratch your head and say, well, how could this have, gone through with an air conditioning vendor? What could they have done differently to avoid that? And honestly, what can we do after the fact to restore confidence with the public? Now, are individuals safer? The more information is out there, the bigger the risk. I think from an individual perspective, people need to learn people need to learn that when they make the choice to publicly share information, which they do all the time through Facebook and otherwise out in the world with our phones that we carry with us everywhere, the more you put about yourself out there, the more risk that stuff is going to fall into the hands of people you don't want it to. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect in the minds of a lot of folks. And it is a generational issue that's been brought up already to some extent, but there's, on the one hand, there's the expectation we can share whatever we want. And not only that, we're entitled to share whatever we want. And if you don't give us products and services that allow us to do that, we're going to be very angry with you. At the same time, you better not let that information fall into the hands of someone, I don't care if it's the government or the bad guys or whoever, or even somebody sending me marketing that I don't like, right? So it's very, very tricky, and I think education is crucial. But the point that was made, and from a legal perspective, this is very important too, the point that was made about making it personal for people, like what if this was you, what if this was your family, what if this was your children, because if, I'm going to pick on marketing people because they're the most fun to pick on. If I work for the marketing group and we really, really want to push out this new service that's going to allow us to track people wherever they go online and target them with all kinds of interesting advertising, we're going to store that data in the cloud, we're going to create profiles, and then we're going to be able to monetize that in who knows how many ways. I mean, it's amazing, right? Just think of all the possibilities. But what if that was your daughter's information or your grandmother's information? How would you feel about it in that situation? And that's, I think, in sometimes a good way to try to find an appropriate middle ground. How can we minimize the surprise element, which is something a lot of regulators have started to talk about, surprise minimization, avoiding unpleasant surprises, and nonetheless provide services that are consistent with people's expectations.
Thank you. I wanted to follow that up, and this is sort of a question back to Tanya or Emily as attorneys. In this area of privacy, case law and cases, are they, what's happening in terms of how that's being developed? Are there cases that attorneys can rely on to guide their clients in the areas of privacy and security? Are we still kind of waiting for some cases to happen to give you guidance for your clients?
I'll jump in first and then I'll let Emily pick up. So privacy is a funny area legally because there's actually so many sub areas of what it is. The things that deal with employee privacy, the things that deal with consumer privacy, things that deal with marketing privacy. And in this country, the laws are very sectoral. So we have high levels of regulation for privacy for those in the financial services sector and in healthcare, HIPAA, which most people are familiar with. So for financial services and HIPAA, there are very strict regulations that say this is how you have to develop your security program. This is how you have to, so you have to do certain things, protect information. You can share information in these ways, but not in these other ways. You have to provide these notices. And in the EU, as Emily pointed out, there are also much more stringent laws and in other non-US jurisdictions as well. In the, quote, non-regulated space, which is everybody else, the truth is we're not really that non-regulated anymore, because the Federal Trade Commission has developed what it kind of considers to be its own common law of privacy and data security, which, by the way, is not actually law, just so we're clear. But that doesn't really seem to matter either to the FTC or the courts so far. There appears
there's a case going on about that right now.
There is the Wyndham case where that was challenged, and Wyndham said, wait a minute, just because you have this power under this really broad statute, Section 5 of the FTC Act, that says you can go after unfair practices, doesn't mean you have the right to tell us we didn't have adequate security. There's a big difference. And so far, the courts have said, well, no, they actually did have the right to do that. So it's developing, but there are lots of actual standards out there that aren't law that are good to look at. Things like the NIST, and you can tell us all with the acronym because I always forget. Probably National Institute for Standards and Technology. I think I'm starting picking on you, but NIST has standards. ISO, the ISO 27001 and 2 standards. So there are also private standards out there, or not law, but standards that are helpful to try to develop best practices as well. I'll let Emily elaborate on that.
Yeah, and self-regulation is also key. But I think it actually ties back very well to what you mentioned as the whack-a-mole problem. Because I think in the area of technology, where things are changing every day and you have these new great products and services that are coming out on the daily, how are we going to develop tech-neutral laws and regulations that are going to be able to account for that? So I think that's something that we have to figure out how to meld.
I asked my stepson, is it okay for me to show this tomorrow? And he said, yeah, I think so. But, it wasn't quite, I don't want it,
We'll keep it confidential.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a big issue right now. I mean, as you were saying, there is developing law, but I think the key is to make sure that we, when developing that law, have flexibility in the way that it's done. I think having prescriptive guidelines and rules and regulations actually could inhibit technology in a way that we may not want. So I think, as Tanya was saying, coming from Microsoft, we are being told by consumers that they have expectations that we're going to be producing products that delight them and are always seamlessly providing them with everything that they need at the touch of a button. And in order to do that, with laws continuing to develop in one direction and people's reasonable expectations maybe going in another, we need to find a way to come to some kind of consensus.
And that's not even scratching the surface, by the way, on government access issues, which we haven't really talked about, but there's a whole legal environment involving what the government can have access to, which has certainly gotten a lot of public attention over the last year. And Microsoft and other companies have been, publicly vocal about issues related to whether the laws should be changed to restrict the ability of the government to get access to information. So.
Thank you very much. Russell, we've touched upon the cloud. Cloud's been mentioned a couple times. I think Tanya did. And so in relative technological terms, it's been around for a while. So from your perspective, what should corporations, companies do? What should they think about if they're contemplating moving their data to the cloud? What are some of the issues that should concern them?
So I would say the first thing you have to do when you're making that decision is to understand why you're making the decision. And there's a lot of pretty obvious reasons for doing it in terms of cost, in terms of scale, in terms of maintenance and support, but a lot of times customers get caught up in what I call the steak versus the sizzle. Ooh, that's cool, I want to do it. Well, that's the sizzle, right? The steak is how you do it, the process that you go through. Anybody can sit down on a computer and drag a file or a folder from one piece of infrastructure to the other, and voila, your data's in the cloud, right? What our firm spends most of its time doing up front is having the conversations and going through a structured process to make sure that the customer is, number one, actually prepared to do this, because going to the cloud requires some fundamental changes to how your premises infrastructure works. And number two, it's not a concept of, and there's a lot of cases of this, it's not your mess for less, meaning everything you have on premises sucks. You didn't maintain your hardware, you don't back your data up, so I'm just going to throw it over the fence and one of these vendors is going to solve the problem. There's still a lot of responsibility for you as a customer. But I think to make a finer point on this, I want to kind of flip and talk about from a consumer perspective. And I'm going to start by saying there's a difference between a consumer and a customer. And I'm going to just do a little test here to show you guys. Raise your hand if you have a Gmail account. Keep your hand up if you're paying for it. Oh, so there's a lot of consumers of Gmail. There are no customers of Gmail in this room. And you could substitute Hotmail or whatever other product you want, but it's a very fine distinction between customer and consumer, because everyone that raised their hand, I have an account too, you are the inventory for Google's primary business, which is selling advertising in a targeted way. No matter what you may think, the majority of Google's income comes from selling advertising services. So you have to scratch your head and say, if I'm going to pick a provider and I'm going to go to the cloud, any provider, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, VMware, IBM, AT&T, you have to ask what their business is. How are they driving revenue? What are their values? What's their mission? And decide if that's in alignment with what you do. And there are some very good cases for small businesses that are entrepreneurial to say, well, these providers are faster, they're doing things more innovatively, they're using the technologies I like, so I'm willing to take some more risk in exchange for getting this value to my business. On the other hand, there's some other organizations who are more traditional, more controlled, have more compliance issues that are saying, you know what, gee, I think I have to be hyper cautious about how I'm going to move there. And so when you look at a customer, and in our company we have 2 firewalled practices. We hate each other's guts, essentially. I'll give an example of that maybe in a minute. But I run the Microsoft business. We also have a Google business. The approach and the focus of those 2 sets of customers is very different, and you can see. It's how fast can we get going? When can we be up? On the Microsoft side, it's let's have a conversation. Let's talk through this process. Have you read Microsoft's privacy policy? Have you gone to the Trust Center? What is your environment like? And those are the things that will not necessarily make you secure or keep you private, but they will enable you to have prepared a response when the inevitable breach happens, because it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the revenue we make, it's not from the dragging, dropping of mailbox from your on-premises server to the cloud server. It's from all the work that's required to do the due diligence and make sure that at the end state, not only have you bought a platform that best suits your business needs and best aligns with your company's values, but that also you're going to operate and maintain it in a way that's going to make sense for you in the future. And I think that is really what the fundamental process should be, instead of saying, ooh, I'm going to save $2 per user per month on email, multiply that by 10,000 employees, or an Edison-sized number of employees. You start to say, wow, that's a good savings. How can I keep driving costs lower? Okay, well, what's the other side of that equation, right? So I think that's probably how I would look at starting the migration process.
Thank you. I have something was mentioned about employee security. And for example, where I work, at our desktops, we have to go through a little bit of a protocol to get, password and that type of thing to get to our sort of our intranet page there. I'm just wondering, for our panel, are there how much in terms of employee feedback and suggestions have you seen or heard about that has developed some of the maybe current protocols for security and data and that type of thing? Michael?
Right. So as I mentioned, we have a pretty sophisticated program. As a matter of fact, this month is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. You know, we're having a series of cyber expos. We do this outside of October as well, because we want to engage in dialogue with folks. We want to find out, where their pain points are, right? So people will give us feedback like, hey, how do I remember all these passwords, right?
Yeah.
So, we educate them. We talk about password managers. We give them some information, right? Because we find that there's some people who feel the burden of compliance is too great. And so that's why they're not adhering to the standards, because they don't know how to comply in an easy way. So we have to be subject matter experts and then help them, and serve them. So having dialogue, having these kinds of events where they get a chance to see our cybersecurity people. We're working closely with our privacy people now, information governance, that's how I got here. And so they get a chance then to see the customers, the consumers, right? And find out where their pain points are, where the challenges are. Things like being able to share data in a safe way. There's certain data that if it's going to be shared, it needs to be encrypted, right? Because it's sensitive information. And if people don't know how to encrypt it, they don't know what tool to use, they don't have the mechanism, they're going to create a path through the woods on their own, right? They'll go get a Dropbox account, or they'll go get whatever they got to do to get the business happening. So we need to enable the business while, remaining secure. And I think that having a strong cyber at home culture, because it is really about shifting the culture, is a great tool in being able to engage the users and shift from the perception of cybersecurity or security or privacy being something done to them as opposed to something they're participating in, right? And then, there's a great value add in that.
Great. Thank you. Is there
And
any
I'd
other
just add
comments?
to the comment about how to do it. The thing that we see all the time with customers is change management and training for organizations, whether it's small, medium, or large. And the reason why people start to use Dropbox, setting aside the arguments for we don't have this capability at the office, because you could argue there's ways to enable that capability. They did it because it was easy. They did it because they didn't have to read instructions. They did it because it was on their phone, it was on their iPad, it was, hopefully somebody has a Surface besides me in the room, it was on their Surface. I worked for Microsoft in a previous life, so that's why. So if you as an organization are not enabling a technology solution that's easy for your users to consume, they will consume something else that's easy. So you have to think about that when you're making your investment. Is this easier or harder? Nobody wants to go back to the days of green screens and having to know all the function keys and how to flip through. What they want to do is drag and drop. They want to do it while they're driving to dinner when they get an email, not, oh, I better go back to the house and sit down on a desktop PC.
Yeah, and to touch on that, I think also people, no matter what your business is, you have to continually consider that your customers are going to want to know that they have a platform that values their security and their privacy as much as they do. So I think that would be key, no matter what kind of business you're in, to keep in the back of your mind is trust is paramount these days. And that's why you see so many companies using privacy as their differentiator in their business as well. So I think that's something also that touches on those things.
Thank you very much. The good old days, the green screen and the floppy disks and DOS. Remember that? Now I'd like to turn over to our audience here, and I'm sure that the thoughts and that our panelists have mentioned have hopefully triggered some thoughts in you and questions. So please let's start off with some questions and answers. And sir, if you might please just say your name and who you're from, would be great.
What I would say is, setting aside vendor selection, in 10 years to 15 years, you'll pay for two things. You'll pay for the speed of your pipe, and you'll pay for the kilowatt hours used by your provider. You will not even license software where you buy a copy of Office or you buy a copy of your server software. The only thing that's slowing this down is transforming customers, but all your data is going to be in the cloud. I think it's a foregone conclusion by most technologists now. And the faster that providers deliver fiber to your doorstep, and you have a gigabit link, and the faster that we get 5G or 6G or whatever the new cellular service is, the less need you're going to have to buy and maintain hardware that's going to become obsolete. You're going to let someone else do that. So the question becomes, who do you want to pay? What's their price model? And what are their documented policies around how they're going to secure everything from the moment it leaves your facility to the moment it gets to theirs? So most vendors right now are offering private routing, so you don't have to go over the internet. If you want to get a AT&T provisioned circuit that's in a virtual private network that AT&T manages, you can connect to Microsoft, or you can connect
And we
to
certainly hope so.
Amazon.
On AT&T.
You always have to plug the moderator. So you could buy that versus going out over the open internet right now if you wanted to and pay the premium. Some people do, some people don't. But I think that's where it's going.
And I want to address the recourse point, because be careful about that, because just because you're getting the greater protection, or hopefully getting the greater protection in terms of what the security safeguards are and paying for it, doesn't mean you're actually going to have recourse if there's an issue. So if there's an issue and you want to be able to have that availability, what you have to negotiate goes a little bit beyond. It involves things like indemnification, making sure that limits of liability are not such, for example, that you're restricted to whatever you paid in the last 12 months for the service. Because if you've got, 50,000 tenants whose information has been breached due to something that your service provider did, whatever you paid the service provider in the last 12 months might not be enough to make you feel whole in that situation. This is the problem that the folks I work with deal with day in and day out. And I actually represent people on both sides of the equation. So I represent people who purchase these services, and I represent providers of these services. And we have to find some appropriate middle ground. There was a point in time a few years ago when, if you were going into the cloud, the service provider would come to you and say, here's our terms and conditions, you can take them or leave them, thank you very much. But that's not happening anymore. And there are negotiations going on now. Not if you're paying nothing, and not if you're paying very little for the service. But if you're an enterprise and you're paying a decent amount of money for a service, you should be trying to negotiate these things, because otherwise you may really still have no recourse in the situation.
We had a question, Bob.
I grew up in computing, you can see by my hair, a long time ago. And to give you an indication of what security meant, it was in the Navy. And generally, no one worried about anything other than us having a log on. The one thing that they really worried about, and this was on the tail end of the Cold War, is that our computer had a seal on it that said it was Phoenix protected. So that meant that no Russian could park out in front of our building and zoom into my computer and pick up all the unclassified stuff in the world that I was working on. 28 years ago, I started my own practice, consulting. And I decided that the best way to secure my client data, and my client data is really, really sensitive, because a lot of it is strategic in nature, talks about business plans, talks about litigation issues, all kinds of stuff that you don't want exposed. So I said to myself, the best way to do this is to keep all that stuff completely outside my computer. And it really embarrassed me with that little diskette. But that's what I did. Everything for my clients went on a diskette. So it was outside the realm of the computer. And I abandoned that a few years ago by going to thumb drives. And my computer consultant told me that I needed to have a couple of things to protect my computer, like a malware scanner, and I've got AVG on it, and it gets turned off every night when I leave the office, and all kinds of stuff. And I periodically get warnings from AVG and from Malwarebytes telling me, hey, we just saved your back end. And it is irritating as hell to me to have to pay $100 or $200 to my computer guy to restore my computer when some Malwarebytes got into my computer. And he says to me, Bob, I appreciate that you're putting up a good fight. He said, but there are guys in Russia that are left over from the Cold War that don't have any appropriate civil employment, but they have a lot of computer skills, and they do nothing but develop code that's going to get into your computer no matter what you do. What do I do? I mean, I'm lost. 2 months ago, no, 6 So if you have your critical data protected and your computer doesn't work, you're really up a river.
Yeah, yeah.
So can we help?
How does a small practitioner survive in this environment?
Bob, you answered your own question. When you said the word backup, right, that is the number one strategy that any of us can do. Because all data is simply ones and zeros written on magnetic media. It's all going to go away someday, you know? So we got to back it up. And back up the backup in certain cases, right? I love your cloud solution because this is the original cloud, right? Right? But you said it. It's the backup. It's, you know, we've got to back up our data.
And by the way, encryption, because encryption,
Yes.
because if even if you still have your data, someone else now has your data too. And if it's encrypted, it's protected, and you may not have obligations to notify those people whose data was lost.
I give every one of my clients the absolute assurance in my scope of work document that I will take every step possible
Right.
to protect their data.
Right. Well,
I'd just like to add that, you know, I think that it's hard for people to put a notion of budget towards investing in this because it's, you know, virtual. But I would give you the argument it's the same thing as maintaining your car. Get the oil changed, change the air filter, check the tires, do that stuff. It's a part of the cost of ownership, but it's the part that's typically forgotten because people look at it as, oh my gosh, I'm paying for this and I don't see where the value is because I'm paying for it when I don't want to, or I'm paying for software that I don't really enjoy, right? So, you know, find the right package or find a firm that can support you. We actually do that work. I'd be happy to talk to you about it later for small businesses here in the Valley. You know, it's just something you're going to have to come to expect. It's the new way of the world. And
I think
agree that it
also,
sucks.
Bob, you can consider something that a lot of people may not know until they start doing the research and talking to people and providers like Russell is that storing things in the cloud actually can be more secure than the diskette and usually is more secure than the traditional methods. And in part it's because, you know, companies like Microsoft do have all this IT infrastructure in place to secure your data, and there's levels and levels and levels of redundancy that you don't have. And when there is a system outage, your productivity is not going to be disrupted in the same way that it would be when it's just you.
We're nearing the end, so we're going to go to this gentleman and this gentleman with the last question. So, sir, and then we'll wrap it up. That gentleman.
The panel in general, a few comments on managing expectations of privacy, with the argument that there is a definition of privacy, and that privacy is not generational, given due deference to the word education. Managing expectation of privacy.
For consumers or customers?
Context, and that is that we believe as American citizens we have an expectation of privacy, and yet through implied or explicit actions that we take, we give away our rights to privacy. And I think you all talked about it quite well. I do think that there is a definition of privacy. It's Title Code. We have Title Code 18, Section 2510. That's a pretty good job. But I think more importantly, we're not educating enough people on how do you manage privacy. For all of us, it's what we call Nordstroms, and the first thing we hear is this call may be recorded for quality assurance purposes. You want to return this letter, you stay on the phone. If you don't want to return this letter because you don't want them picking up your voice, you get off the phone. We do that today with our social media. So managing expectation of privacy. We think we're entitled to privacy, and yet we know that there are significant breaches.
right. Well, so the reason I don't think there's really a definition, you're right, there are some statutes that purport to define privacy or purport to define personal information. And by the way, they're all different, depending on what you're looking at. If you read, there's a professor from George Washington University, Dan Solov, who is very well regarded in this space, and he has written extensively on privacy, and he has spent his whole life trying to understand what it means, and he writes very eloquently about why you can't really pin it down. You know, do we go back to the notions of Brandeis, and who's the other one with Brandeis, who I'm going to forget now, but who wrote about meaning that privacy means your right to be left alone, right? Is that what it is? That may not be exactly what it means in today's world with the technology that we have, and given the conflicting desire of people to share certain information. So I do think that it's very contextual, as Emily was saying, and that it morphs over time. In terms of managing expectations, again, very context specific, and we talked about culture earlier. I have clients who I sit down with who will say, we have a very open culture here. We don't want to tell people, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. So what they have to do to manage expectations is very different from an organization that has a culture that says from the top down, we don't, you shall not do these things, and that's expected, right? So look to the fair information principles, fair information privacy principles, or FIPS, that are out there that you can find with the FTC about basic ideas of how data can be collected, used, shared, and what people's expectations are and how you manage that. There's a lot of great resources out there, but I really don't think it's a one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think actually you mentioned Dan Solov, and I recently was looking at something he wrote, calling it to play privacy self-management. And it's the death of privacy self-management these days, because there's limited information out there, and what information is out there sometimes people don't necessarily take advantage of. And I think individuals need to take some responsibility for the decisions that they do make. I was reading an article this morning that talked about terms of use that included in allowing somebody to use this free internet service. They included hidden in their terms of use. It was an experiment. You would give the rights to your firstborn child. Right. And people willingly wanted to use this portal and didn't read the terms of use. And so we have to take some level of responsibility for the decisions that we're making. And I think that's really important. I do think context is key.
Yeah. I just add a couple of things. I really picked up on your generational comment. I had another call on the way up here. One of my employees who's about 26 years old, and he said, "Are you coming in the office?" I said, "No, I'm going to speak at this privacy panel. Do you have any advice?" He goes, "Yeah, tell him there is no such thing anymore. Get over it." He literally said that, and he's 26. That's what everyone in his generation, all the people that work for me that age, believe. But I think what's really interesting is that if we think about it, and I'm kind of in between your generation and his generation, George Orwell got it right except for two things. Number one, it didn't happen in 1984. And number two, it's not the government, it's all of us. So it's the new normal, and if collectively society decides to establish a battle for privacy, that's the only way I think we're really going to see change. But you can't legislate it into being, you can't enforce it into being, you can't,
If I may, I'll close with it's managing the expectation of privacy. 26-year-old doesn't have an expectation of privacy. 66-year-old does.
Thank you. Yeah. Before we wrap up, we have time for one more question. A quick question, please.
This is a big, evolving, developing area. Things like telematics and other cars, not really smart cars, cars that have these capabilities. And if you're interested, there's been a lot written on the space. I think you do have some choices, and whoever you were talking to probably wasn't fully educated on all of those things. If you're interested, because I also know some people who work in the automobile industry and do privacy-related things in that industry. If you have a card, I'd be happy to send you some information afterwards about that. But there are, yes, I think that industry is catching up on this stuff at this point. Because again, we all want that great functionality that gives us all these options in our car. But I do think you have some choices, so yeah, find out.
And at a recent conference, there was some discussion about the Internet of Things and how privacy is becoming a pervasive issue that we didn't even think about it, right? So monitoring someone's electrical usage would tell you whether they work days or they work nights. Would tell you a lot about their lifestyles, right? And so this kind of information wasn't thought about when we began to plan these smart devices, the smart microwave and the smart oven and that sort of thing. So it's an evolving thing. Context is key. We're learning, and technology is popping up so quickly that even professionals, people who are immersed in it every day, are still learning about new technologies, new opportunities. So
The whack-a-mole problem.
it's whack-a-mole. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, we've come to the end of our panel. Great information and a lot of, stay tuned, I think, is the watchword on this one. Again, I'd like to thank our track sponsors, Caruso Affiliate and Southwest Airlines, and also AT&T, yay, AT&T. And please, let's give a warm thank you to our panelists, Emily, Michael, Tanya, and Russell. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to fill out your goldenrod survey,
Yeah, no, thank you.
and really appreciate that.
For years,
The luncheon
because
program
we look
begins
like
at
that, so for
12:45, so we encourage you to visit all of the exhibitors and turn in your bingo card,
Good stuff, man.
so you get that Southwest or Seaport prize. Thank you.
Cyber Expo.